Okay, we're on to Romans again. Last week we finished chapter 2. Today we're going to begin in chapter 3. We're in the section, I forget what the heading is on this. It was several pages ago, but we're in the section that we're dealing with. We've dealt with the unrighteousness of the Gentiles. We just finished dealing with the unrighteousness of the Jews. We also just ended with this verse, verse 28 and 29 of chapter 2 that says, "For he is not a Jew, which is one outwardly, neither is that circumcision which is outward in the flesh, but he is a Jew, which is one inwardly, and circumcision is that of the heart in the spirit and not in the letter, whose praise is not of men, but of God." We just finished pointing out last week as we closed that God's children are true Jews. I want you to understand something too. I was talking to Wendy about this morning on the way over here. We talk about the Jews being a different race. You know, in fact, you'll hear me say that salvation is by grace, it's not by race. It's really not a race. There's really only one race, and we're called humans. We all come from Adam and Eve. This idea of different races got its start in the ideas of evolution. If you read or if you look at Origin of the Species, I don't remember the exact title to that, but it deals with the struggle of different races. And the idea in evolution is that some races are more evolved than others. That's where all this racism stuff comes from. It doesn't come out of a Bible. God doesn't teach racism. And the Jews, when you really think about it, they weren't a race. They were a family. God didn't choose a particular race. He chose a family. He chose the people that were born out of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob to be the nation that he was going to deal with, that was going to be his church for that period of time. That was a family. It wasn't a race. Abraham wasn't a Jew. The term Jew didn't even come around until his great-grandson was born. So I think we need to remember that. And, you know, we talk about people being anti-Semitic as if that has something to do with the Jews. It's not just Jews that are Semites. There's a whole bunch of folks over there in the Middle East that would be considered Semitic because they come from Shem, the three sons of Noah. Remember, there was Ham, Japheth, and Shem? And those that came from that line, those are Semites. So Arabs are Semites just like Jews are Semites. But we've gotten this thing really confused. So let's remember that we're talking about this family. We're not talking about a race. God's not a racist. He doesn't pick one race over another. And if he did, then he'd be a respecter of persons, and we dealt with that earlier as well. Now that we've dealt with the fact that a person's Jewishness does not come based on their family lineage or race or whatever else you want to call it, but it's strictly based upon whether or not they're a child of God, you can see how even Caucasian folks can be Jews. Even black folks can be Jews. Even Asian people can be Jews. It's based on whether or not you're one of God's children. That defines what a Jew is today. So I hope that all y'all are Jews. Because if you're God's children, in God's mind, you're a Jew. Now think about this also. And this is a kind of a weird thing. Get off. Watch me get off on a limb here. They talk about America, and I heard some people talking today, this last week, about the greatest generation. You've heard that phrase. That would have been my folks. My folks were part of what they termed the greatest generation. Some of you probably be your grandparents, but those that fought World War II, that's what was looked at as the greatest generation. You think about how America had had been, even though it wasn't founded by Christians, it was founded on biblical principles. This country was founded on biblical principles. And as long as we followed those biblical principles, this country prospered. Something happened right after World War II that changed all of this, and it had absolutely nothing to do with hippies. We got in bed with the Zionist movement. America, the political system of America, got in lockstep with the bunch of people over there that now call themselves Israel. And we quit looking at the bad things that, they do bad things just like everybody else does bad things. But we've turned a blind eye to all the bad stuff they did. And we only look at the good. And you notice that from that point, from about 1948 until the present day, this country has been slipping. We've gotten away from what we were founded on. So folks understand, I realize there are a lot of religions out there that teach that thing over there in the Middle East is God's Israel and those are God's Jews. That's not the case. That's not God's Israel, and those are not God's Jews. Some of them might be if they're God's elect, but they're not all God's Jews. God's Jews are sitting in this room and other rooms like this. And the prophecies that we read about the Israelites over in the Old Testament that haven't been fulfilled yet, they're talking about you. They're not talking about a group of people over in a country called Israel. Okay? And once you can understand that, you can see a lot more about what's really going on when you read some of those prophecies. Think of it in terms of the church. The Jews were here in fact, we're going to cover this right now. Look at verse 3, or chapter 3. Paul has now explained that Jews, not all Jews are Jews, okay? And some Gentiles are. And so here's the first objection. We've got a couple of objections, 5 of them, that are now made to this argument. And the first one goes like this: what advantage then hath the Jew? Or what profit is there of circumcision? There's the objection. The objection that, because Paul has just shared the fact that Scripture is not necessary in order to gain eternal life. The Jews believed that Scripture was necessary. You had to understand the Scriptures in order to get eternal life. And Paul just explained that that's not the case. And you also had to be Jewish in order to have eternal life. And Paul explained that that's not the case. And so their first objection is, well then, if Scripture isn't the way to eternal salvation, and if the Jews are no different than the Gentiles, then what was the point of being Jewish to begin with? What was the point of that? What advantage then hath the Jew, or what profit is there of circumcision? Why was this even here? And Paul answers it by saying, much every way chiefly, because that unto them were, past tense, were committed the oracles of God. In the past, the Jews were God's church. And the law was committed to them, the service of God was committed to them, and they were examples for us in the New Testament to see how God deals with his children. That's what they were there for. But the Jews had taken what they were intended for and completely perverted it into something else. And so their argument and their objection is, well then what was the point? Well, you didn't understand the point, just why you were here to start with. You didn't understand that you had to be here so that the bloodline could remain pure, so that we could pick where the Messiah came from. And you didn't understand that you were going to be an example to God's children in future days so that they could look back and garner teaching from how God dealt with you. That was the point. And the oracles were committed. At that, in the Old Testament, this Jewish service meant something, but not in the New. The service of God has been reformed. It was reformed by Jesus Christ. And so the oracles were committed to the Jews, but not now. Does that make sense? Okay, so that's the first objection and the first answer to it. What was the point? Well, there was a purpose for the Jewish family in the past, but not now. There's no real reason for it anymore. Okay? There's no distinction. There's no difference. At the moment that Christ died and the veil in the temple was rent in twain from the top to the bottom, that opened it up. And there's now no difference between Jews and Gentiles. There's no special treatment that Jews get. There's no special, they don't have their own system and we have ours. There's only one. They refer to some people as Messianic Jews. Well, they shouldn't be Messianic Jews. If they believe the gospel, they're Christians, not Messianic Jews. You see, there's not a difference. You think about it, was Paul a Messianic Jew? He didn't consider himself a Messianic Jew. He was a Jew. What about Peter? What about John? No, they were Christians. Believers are Christians, regardless of what family they come from. Makes no difference. Okay? So that's objection number one. Objection number two, verses 3 and 4. For what if some did not believe? Shall their unbelief make the faith of God without effect? God forbid, yea, let God be true, but every man a liar, as it is written, that thou mightest be justified in thy sayings, and mightest overcome when thou art judged. This objection goes something like this. If man doesn't believe, then are God's hands tied? Have you ever heard this one? You've heard this objection. Well, God can't save you unless you let him. You ever heard that? If you don't believe, then God's hands are tied and he wants to save you, but if you don't believe, he can't. That's kind of a wimpy God, don't you think? If you think, well, if he can't save me unless I let him, then as Conrad Jarrell used to say, he can't damn me unless I let him. I got more power than this guy? I'm the determining factor of what goes on? That's really what that doctrine teaches. But that's the objection, and I know all of you have heard it before. God can't save you unless you let him. You've probably heard it from, if you went to a Baptist church, you've heard it from the pulpit during the altar call. And that's standard objection. Now, the answer here is a little bit complex, and it's going to take a few minutes to get through it. The first thing I want you to notice is that the faith of God is contrasted with the unbelief of man. Okay? The faith of God is contrasted with the unbelief of man. Now, I realize that there are people that don't believe that God can have faith because God knows everything, and how can you have faith in something you already know? Well, we have faith in things that we already know all the time. That's called certitude. I would venture a guess that just about everybody in this room would agree that if I let go of this, what's it going to do? Is it going to float, or is it going to hit the ground? How many of you believe it's going to hit the ground? I hope all of you, because it hit the ground. Now, you believed it would, and it did. Did you know it was gonna? Yeah. You were already certain that it was going to hit the ground, right? So you can have faith in things that you know. And that's the kind of faith God has. He has certain faith. Now, most of the time we have to deal with what we call sure faith. We can have an assurance that something is true, even though we may not know it as certain as a book hitting the ground if you let go of it. Right? We have faith in things because of evidences, because of things that, one of the things you look at the Bible, if you read the Bible and you look at the prophecies, I think there's something like 1,500 Old Testament prophecies that have been fulfilled to the letter. Well, you can then, if you look at that and say, well, 1,500 of them are fulfilled, then chances are the ones that haven't been fulfilled yet are going to be fulfilled. You can have faith in that based on the evidence. There are a lot of things that you can look at, and when you, and especially when it comes to the Bible, that you can study things and go, yeah, I believe that. Well, it's not blind faith. You're actually looking at something that's teaching. So that's assurance. We can have assurance that we're a child of God, but we can't know for certain. You know when you're going to know for certain? When you close your eyes in death, then you'll know for certain. But until then, you can only have assurance. And that assurance is based on evidences. You're the only one in the room that really knows what you believe. I don't know. You can tell me whatever you want, and I can either believe you or not, but you see what I mean? I'm the only one that really knows what I believe. I can profess what I believe, and you can then say, well, it sounds like he believes that. But how do you really know unless you're me? You don't. Okay, so you can have assurance. I can have assurance that I'm a child of God based on the fact of what I believe. But I'm not going to know until I get there, and neither will anybody else. That's why we try to remain faithful, because the only assurance that you can have that you're a child of God is that you continue in the faith, grounded and settled. Now that doesn't mean that if you walk off that you ended up lost. You might never have been saved to begin with, or maybe you're just disobedient. But the only way you can have that assurance is if you remain faithful. That's the only way you can have that type. But that's not certitude. You can't be certain of this. That's a different type of faith. Now God, you know, most of the things that we deal with in life when it comes to faith, most of them are sure type of faith. They're not certain type of faith. But with God, everything's certain. God believed that at the appointed time, Jesus Christ would come into the world and would pay the price on the cross. He believed that. Now, he knew it would happen. He's God. But that doesn't change the fact that he believed that it would come to pass. That's the faith of God. Okay? Now I want you to see a couple of things real quick. First, I want you to turn to 2 Thessalonians chapter 3. We're going to contrast God's faith with man's lack of faith. 2 Thessalonians chapter 3 and verse 3. But the Lord is faithful, who shall establish you and keep you from... Oh wait, look at verse 2. This is I love this verse. This is Paul praying. He's going on a missionary trip, and most free willers think that the idea of going on a missionary trip is to go out and find wicked and unreasonable men and get them saved, right? Change them from being wicked and unreasonable men and turning them into being saints. But look at what Paul says. Look at verse 1. Finally, brethren, pray for us, that the word of the Lord may have free course and be glorified, even as it is with you, and that we may be delivered from unreasonable and wicked men. For all men have not faith. You see, our job isn't to go out and find wicked and unreasonable men and convince them to be faithful. Our job is to go find people that already have faith and teach them how they got it. Okay? So here's the lack of faith of man, and then in verse 3 it says, but the Lord is faithful, who shall establish you and keep you from evil. And so, you know, some of these guys will say, well, that doesn't say that God has faith. Well, if the Lord is faithful, faithful means he's full of faith. I don't see how that doesn't teach that God has faith. Clearly he does. But his faith is certain. He knows what's going to happen, and he believes it'll happen. Look at 2 Timothy chapter 2 and verse 13. If we believe not, there's the lack of faith of man. If we believe not, yet he abideth faithful, he cannot deny himself. Okay? So we see a contrast between man's lack of faith and God's faith. So when we deal with what if some did not believe, shall their unbelief make the faith of God without effect? That's the question. Here's the answer. God forbid, yea, let God be true, but every man a liar. In other words, no. The lack of faith on the part of man will not make the faith of God without effect. What God has determined, what God believes will happen whether you believe it or not. He doesn't need you to bring about what he's doing. If he decides he's going to save somebody, he's going to save them, even if they're kicking and screaming all the way to heaven. Okay? So there's the answer. God forbid, yea, let God be true, but every man a liar. But then it goes on to say, as it is written, that thou mightest be justified in thy sayings, and mightest overcome when thou art judged. This thou is referring to God, that God might be justified in his sayings, and mightest overcome when he's judged. Well, what in the world does that mean? Who judges God? Everybody. Everybody. Fallen man, and that includes everybody in the room, even if you're born again, you're still got this flesh that you're hung on with, right? Fallen man constantly and consistently thinks that God is wrong. Now, once you get into a church, you start to understand that maybe he's not, and you're not doing it as often as you did before you got in the church. But people out there in the world, they always think God's wrong. They consistently and constantly believe that God's wrong. And so what does fallen man do? He tries to prove that God's wrong. And he does it over and over and over and over and over and over again. That's what God has certain economic teachings inside of this book. And if you build an economy or a nation based on the teaching in this book, one of the things that he says is that a man that won't work, neither shall he eat. That doesn't sound like a welfare state, does it? There are economic teachings in this book that if you establish a country or a company or whatever on this, it will prosper and it will work. What does man do? What are you hearing in the news now? They want to go back to socialism again, right? Which is contrary. It's 180 degrees opposite of what the Bible teaches. But have they not tried it before? Yeah, they've tried it over and over and over again, right? And now they want to do it again. Well, it'll work this time because we weren't the ones. We're smarter than the other bunch, and we've got some twists to it. You see, one of the things that God does is he allows a lot of the evil to go on in this world so that mankind can try every possible alternative to every theme that's out there. Give them a chance to say, well, try it. See if it'll work. And after a few years, you find out, yeah, it didn't work either. We'll try something else. Oh, I got an idea. Let's do it this way. And they'll, a variation on the theme, try it again. And this has been going on since Adam. Mankind trying the same things. He ran out of new stuff by the time that Solomon was here. Solomon said, see, there's no new thing under the sun. They've been doing the same reruns over and over and over again since the time of Solomon. We'll just change it a little bit. Instead of being a socialist, we'll call it democratic socialism. That'll make it different. No, it won't. It'll end up doing the same thing that all the rest of them have done. And in the end, it won't work. And then you'll come up with something new, and you'll think it's new, but it's the same old thing again. And that's one of the reasons that God allows this to happen. So that by allowing men and devils to try every possible alternative, God's justified in the end. He gave you the chance to prove him wrong, and you weren't able to do it. Give you plenty of time. Go ahead and run your little theories out all you want to, but in the end, God will be justified. So you might want to judge God and think that he's wrong. In the end, he's going to be right. And you're going to be the one standing there with egg all over your face. That's what that verse is saying. Okay? In Jim speak. Okay, so the fact that some do not believe does not change the faith of God. And we're going to get into the faith of God a little bit later in this chapter and in others. Let God be true, but every man a liar, as it is written, that thou mightest be justified in thy sayings and mightest overcome when thou art judged. In the day of judgment, God's book is going to stand as the authority. And man's going to have had plenty of opportunity to go at it in a different direction, only to find out that it always fails. Okay? Okay, next objection. Verse 5. But if our unrighteousness commend the righteousness of God, what shall we say? Is God unrighteous who taketh vengeance? I speak as a man. This objection is, if my lie, or if my doing wrong proves that God's right, then is it fair for God to punish me because I proved he was right? Kind of weird, huh? If I do something that makes you look good, is it fair for you to punish me because I made you look good? Well, here's what Paul says about this. God forbid, for then how shall God judge the world? God can't judge the world for wrongdoing unless he condemns wrongdoing. So even if your wrongdoing proves that he's right, you still got the punishment coming. Don't try to wiggle out of it by saying, well, all I did was make you look better. I mean, I know I sinned, but all it did was glorify you because it made you look right. So why would you punish me? Because you sinned. That's why. And that's what, but these are some of these crazy arguments that people come up with. They actually come up with some of this stuff. Here's another one. This is a variation on the same theme. Verses 7 and 8. For if the truth of God hath more abounded through my lie unto his glory, why yet am I also judged as a sinner? So the objection, if my lie points out God's truth, then why am I judged? All I'm doing is helping God. Why would he judge me on that? It's a variation on the theme of the last one. If my lie proves the glory of God, then isn't he wrong to punish me for proving his glory? And the answer is found in verse 8, and not rather, or is that right? Yeah. And not rather as we be slanderously reported, and as some affirm that we say, let us do evil that good may come, whose damnation is just. Here's the answer. And you know what? This is a charge that's leveled against Paul here. That's one of the most common arguments that you hear when you present the doctrine of election and total depravity to someone. And the argument is, well, then what difference does it make if we live righteously or not? If you're elect, what difference does it make whether I live righteous or not? I can go live however I want to. If I'm elect, I can do anything I want. I'm going to heaven anyway, right? Have you heard that one? Yeah, that's an argument that people will make. Well, what's the point? Why? I mean, what you're saying is I can live like the devil and I'm fine. If I'm one of God's children, I go to heaven anyway. Doesn't matter how I live. Okay? There was a guy by the name of J.T. Philpott. He was an old-time primitive Baptist. I think he lived in the 1800s. The unfortunate thing about J.T. Philpott is that he's the one that brought the doctrine of eternal sonship into the primitive Baptist church. He was the one that brought that one in. So he's guilty on that one. But other than that, he was a pretty good old guy. And there's a story about him. He was on a train one time with a free will Baptist preacher, and they were talking. And the free will Baptist preacher said that he didn't agree with Philpott's doctrine on election because he said it leads men to sin. It leads them to lasciviousness, causes men to sin, which is this same argument, okay? And so Philpott said, well, has it led you to sin? And the guy said, well, no, because I don't believe it. And so Philpott said, well, has it led me to sin? And the guy said, well, I guess not. And so Philpott said, well, if it doesn't lead non-believers to sin, and it doesn't lead believers to sin, then who, pray tell, does it lead to sin? And that was kind of the end of the argument. But that's an argument that people make. The answer to the argument is here in verse at the end of verse 8. Okay, so we read, "Let us do evil that good may come." If you're going to make that statement, look at the next verse, "Whose damnation is just." People that make that argument are showing the fact that they are damned. Whose damnation is just. Look at James chapter 1. And this is a common argument that you hear. James chapter 1, beginning at verse 22. "But be ye doers of the word, and not hearers only, deceiving your own selves. For if any be a hearer of the word, and not a doer, he is like unto a man beholding his natural face in a glass. For he beholdeth himself, and goeth his way, and straightway forgetteth what manner of man he was. But whoso looketh into the perfect law of liberty, and continueth therein, he being not a forgetful hearer, but a doer of the work, this man shall be blessed in his deed." You see, it's not enough just to know what the book says. What matters is, do you do what the book says? Do you live the way the book says you should live? If you're a doer, well, then that's an evidence that you're... And you know what? Those that are doers don't come up with an argument of, well, I could live any way I want to then, huh? Obviously they don't, because they're doers, and they're doing what the book says. But those that just hear it and don't do it, some of them may come back at you with the idea, whoa, then you can just live any way you want to. All they're doing is just showing the fact that they're not one of God's elect people, or at least at that point in time, they're not born again. That's all that evidence is, okay? And that brings us to objection number 5, which is found in verse 9. "What then? Are we better than they? No, in no wise, for we have before proved both Jews and Gentiles that they are all under sin." So the objection, are the Jews any better than the Gentiles? Are the Gentiles any better than the Jews? And the answer is no. And like I said earlier, this is not race, this is family. The Jewish people are looked at no differently as far as God is concerned as the Gentiles are. The only way that they were ever looked differently was because they were God's church in the Old Testament days. It had nothing to do, it's never had anything to do with eternal salvation. God was saving Gentiles back then too. You think about Jonah. You remember, if you read the story of Jonah, God goes to him and sends him to Nineveh. Now Nineveh was the capital of Assyria. The Assyrians were some of the most bloodthirsty people that ever lived on the planet, and they were the enemies of Israel. And that's why Jonah didn't want to go. That was the reason that he tried to find a boat to take him in the opposite direction. He didn't want to, I mean, why would you want to go to Nineveh? Nobody wants to go to Nineveh and preach to our enemies. They probably would kill me before I ever got into the city. So he ran away. Well, eventually he ended up going to Nineveh and he preached to them, and guess what happened? They repented. You see, God has had people in of all different families, all races, ever since the dawn of time. But the Jewish nation from Moses until Christ was God's church in the world. That was his system of worship in the world. Since the time of Christ, it's the New Testament church. It was reformed, okay? And so Paul's making the point, no, there's no difference. We're all equal. We're all sinners. Every single one of us. Now that brings us to another major point here, and that is a summary statement that all mankind is unrighteous by nature. Remember, we looked at the Gentiles, we've looked at the Jews, now we're dealing with the whole pot. All of mankind. All mankind is unrighteous by nature. And this runs from chapter 3, verse 10 through verse 20. We'll get started on this today and see how far we can get. Verse 10, as it is written, this first section runs from verse 10 through verse 12. As it is written, there is none righteous, no, not one. There is none that understandeth. There is none that seeketh after God. They are all gone out of the way. They are together become unprofitable. There is none that doeth good, no, not one. How many do good by nature? None. None. There are none right. By nature, nobody's righteous. By nature, nobody does anything good. Now we just discussed earlier in the previous chapter about the Gentiles that had not the law, but do by nature the things contained in the law, and now we're reading that there's none righteous. Well, as we continue on, remember I told you this is like building an archway, and you got to have the form to put everything together. And as we continue on, you're going to see what happens to make these people, make the Gentiles that had not the law do by nature the things contained in the law, and how you reconcile the fact that by nature none of them were righteous. Something happened to those Gentiles that had not the law, and we'll get to that as we get into later chapters, okay? But for now, we're dealing with the nature of mankind. And there's not one good one out there. Not one. Now there's a popular doctrine. Keep your finger here. Turn to Psalm chapter 14. There's a popular doctrine, and it's the idea that when we talk about, free will Baptists like this one a lot, because they can't avoid the fact that the Bible talks about election. So how do we explain away election? I mean, if we're going to teach free will, how do we explain away this idea of election? And what they will generally say is that election is based upon God's looking down at the human race before time and seeing who would accept him, or who would do this, or who would do whatever it is they say you got to do, okay? And then based upon that, he would write their name. So he sees that Wendy is going to accept him, so he writes Wendy's name in the Lamb's Book of Life, and sees that Christina's going to, so he sees Mike, and sees all these people, and okay, and that guy's not going to accept me, so I'm not going to write his name in there, leave him out, right? And that's how election happened. It was all based upon his looking down from heaven ahead of time and knowing what people would do. This is a common teaching. You go talk to a missionary Baptist preacher, you go talk to a Southern Baptist preacher, this is what they're going to tell you election is all about. This is how it works, okay? Couple of problems. A few weeks ago, we went over the fact that God is not a respecter of persons, and I pointed out that if your election was based upon something you did, that makes God a respecter of persons, doesn't it? So that system makes God a sinner, because it's a sin to be a respecter of persons, all right? So number one, that system would make God a sinner. Number two, what's the Bible say about it? Psalm 14. Psalm 14 and Psalm 53 are almost word for word identical. And Psalm 14 says this, The fool hath said in his heart, there is no God. They are corrupt, they have done abominable works, there is none that doeth good. Look at verse 2. The Lord looked down from heaven upon the children of men to see if there were any that did understand and seek God. He did it. He actually did look down at all of mankind to see who would accept him and who wouldn't. And guess what he found? Verse 3, they are all gone aside, they are all together become filthy, there is none that doeth good, no, not one. So if election's based upon God looking down from heaven and seeing that you accepted him, then nobody's elected, because nobody accepted him. Nobody, not one. By nature, when Adam sinned in the Garden of Eden, he absolutely destroyed, well, he killed the human race spiritually. We're likened to dead people. Spiritually, you're dead. And you can't do anything if you're dead. You just, sorry. You can talk to a dead person all you want to. They're not going to get up and move. They're dead. And it's the same way with your spirit. If your spirit's dead, you can't bring it back to life. It takes an act of God to resurrect your spirit and make you born and revive you and give you a new spirit. Look at Romans chapter 5. Scoot ahead a couple of passages here. Romans chapter 5, we'll begin at verse 15, so that we can see how all of this happened. But not as the offense, so also is the free gift. For if through the offense of one many be dead, much more the grace of God and the gift by grace, which is by one man Jesus Christ, hath abounded unto many. And not as it was by one that sinned, so is the gift. For the judgment was by one to condemnation, but the free gift is of many offenses unto justification. For if by one man's offense death reigned by one, much more they which receive abundance of grace and the gift of righteousness shall reign in life by one Jesus Christ. Therefore, as by the offense of one judgment came upon all men to condemnation, even so by the righteousness of one the free gift came upon all men unto justification of life. That all in there refers to all to whom it applies. Okay? For as by one man's disobedience many were made sinners, so by the obedience of one shall many be made righteous. And that one man that caused the entire human race to become sinners was Adam. And it took place in the Garden of Eden. When he ate of that fruit, destroyed the human race. I know Elder Gerald used to think that it messed up the DNA somehow. And so everyone's born with bad genes as a result of it. And since sin passes down from the father, everybody that has Adam as a father was born a sinner. God didn't wait for you to sin to decide whether or not you were guilty or not. David said in one of the Psalms, behold, I was shapen in iniquity, and in sin did my mother conceive me. From the time of conception, he was already a sinner. So it doesn't mean, now you're gonna sin because you're a sinner, and sinners sin. That's what they do. You know, squirrels eat nuts and sinners sin. That's just how it works. That's part of your nature. And there's nothing you can do about it. You sin, and you will. Once you're born again, you have the ability to stop it, but still, you're born a sinner. And none of us, as a sinner, wants to have anything at all to do with God. It takes God to change us first. Once he changes us, that's when you start looking for him. That's when you start wanting to know, what is this? What is it that's changing me here? Okay? So, the point here is that This unrighteous nature of man, our nature, fallen nature, prior to being changed by God, does not have the ability to live righteously. Doesn't have the ability or the desire to seek God. Our nature is just completely running away from God. Okay? That's natural for the fallen man. Okay? So that's verses 10 through 12. The next section, which runs from verses 13 through 18, shows that the actions of man, not just their nature, but their actions are unrighteous. Okay? Verses 13 through 18. Their throat is an open sepulcher. That's a pretty description, isn't it? Every time you open your mouth, God says all he sees is a bunch of dead bones and rotten flesh. That's lovely, right? Their throat is an open sepulcher. With their tongues they have used deceit. They're liars. The poison of asps is under their lips. They're actually injurious. Their speak is injurious. Whose mouth is full of cursing and bitterness. Their feet are swift to shed blood. You say, well, I never killed anybody. Yeah, but you wanted to. One time or another. One time or another. Their feet are swift to shed blood. Destruction and misery are in their ways. And the way of peace have they not known. And the way of peace is found over in Psalm 119 and verse 165. There's no fear of God before their eyes. That's the manner of life of fallen people. It's kind of an apt description of a bunch of folks out there, isn't it? When we really think about it, there's a bunch of people that fits. And here's the sad part. You know, Psalm 14, when David wrote Psalm 14 and Psalm 53, he was writing about the enemies of God's people. And you know what Paul's doing right now? He's using exactly what Paul said, or what David said, to show that that's also an apt description of us. That's what we look like, naturally. That's exactly what God sees of us before you're born again. Now, once you're born again, you're still stuck with the same flesh. Every one of us can drift right back into this in a moment's notice if we let it happen. Every single one of us can. And think about it. This is what fallen man looks like. Doesn't look like the kind of being that would all of a sudden start trying to get good, does it? That's why he said there's none righteous, no, not one. That's why over in Isaiah it talks about all of our righteousness being filthy rags, which translates a word that means dirty minstrel cloth. Try that one on Judgment Day. Get a trash can full of dirty minstrel cloth and go dump that on the throne and see if God will let you into heaven based on that, because that's what your works look like. Doesn't work. Mankind is pretty rotten. And in verses 19 through 20, we have the ultimate condemnation of all of mankind, both Jews and Gentiles, sewed up in a bag and laid on the altar of God. Verse 19. Now we know that what things soever the law saith, it saith to them who are under the law, that every mouth may be stopped, and all the world may become guilty before God. Therefore, by the deeds of the law, there shall no flesh be justified in his sight, for by the law is the knowledge of sin. Let me repeat this. For anybody that wants to think that you can be eternally saved by keeping the law, read this with your own eyes. Therefore, by the deeds of the law, there shall no flesh be justified in his sight. What isn't clear about that? The law was never sent to save people. It's not what it was for. It was never sent as a bunch of conditions for you to meet in order to get eternally saved. No one will ever be justified by keeping the law. Okay? Therefore, by the deeds of the law there shall no flesh. How much flesh is going to be justified? None. No flesh be justified in his sight, for by the law is the knowledge of sin. The ultimate purpose of the law was to condemn the entire human race as sinners. That's what the law was sent for. The law said, you see that over there? That's sin, and you are guilty of it. That's what the law was for. Paul said, I wouldn't have known sin if it wasn't for the law. I wouldn't have known lust unless the law said, thou shalt not covet. You see, you don't know that it's a sin even though you're sinning. You don't realize it until you look at the law. Right? And then the law says, ooh, guilty of that one. Guilty of that one. That was the purpose of the law, to convict man, to convince man that man is a sinner. It was never given as a set of instructions to try to get man to get man saved, eternally or otherwise. That's not what it was for. The law does not say one word about how to get free from it. It only condemns people of being guilty of breaking it. Now, the New Testament, on the other hand, the purpose of the New Testament was to reveal God's grace. That's the purpose of the new. This brings us to another major section. I don't want to get too far involved in this. I'll go a little bit. I'm probably getting close to an hour. Let me introduce it, and then we'll pick up on it next week, because this will work better if it's all tied together. And this is the introduction to the righteousness of God. And this runs through the rest of the chapter, from chapter 3, verse 21 through verse 31. And in verses 21 through 26, we see that the righteousness of God comes by the mutual covenant faith of the Father and the Son in each other. That's how the righteousness of God comes. Now that, we'll read it briefly, but I'm actually going to get into it in detail next week. I don't want to start on this and then not be able to finish it and leave everybody hanging. So let's look at verse 21 to begin with. But now the righteousness of God without the law is manifested, being witnessed by the law and the prophets. I want you to notice something. The righteousness of God, that's God's righteousness, is manifested. What does that mean? That means that that the light is being shined on it. You're able to see it. It doesn't mean that it's now coming about. It means that it's just being shown. It's witnessed. It's like, I know we can't do it in here because of all of the windows and everything, but if you could turn the lights off in this room and it was pitch black and you couldn't see anybody, well, when you turn the lights back on again, is that what brought everybody into existence? No. It just showed everybody who was in the room, right? It manifested. That's what manifested means. In the Old Testament, all of this it's all in there. It was witnessed by the law and the prophets. The law and the prophets taught the righteousness of God, but the New Testament explains some of the darkness over in the Old Testament. It was there, It's nothing new. This was the way it's always been. It's just now in the New Testament it's being manifested. It's being brought to light. It's being explained in a way that you can actually understand it, and then when you go back and look, you can see that it was there all along. This is nothing new. This is nothing different than what Moses taught. It's nothing different than what the other prophets taught. It's just that it was so dark and written in such language it was hard to comprehend. But when you have the New Testament as the commentary on the Old Testament, you can understand what was being said back there. Does that make sense? That's what the term manifested means here. That the righteousness of God without the law is manifested, being witnessed by the law and the prophets. Both the Old Testament law and the prophets spoke of it, but it wasn't brought into light until Christ came. It wasn't really that understandable until all the dots got pieced together. Okay? Now we have the New Testament to explain the Old Testament, and we can look back and see in the law and in the prophets the teaching about the righteousness of God and salvation of His people through the sacrifice of His Son. You know, you go back and you read Isaiah. If you didn't have the New Testament, you read some of Isaiah, you'd wonder, what in the world is he talking about here? It wouldn't make a lot of sense. But once you have the New Testament story and you can look at that and say, oh, well, that's a prophecy of Christ coming into the world and suffering on the cross, and then it makes sense. You see, it's being manifested. And it was always there. There's two witnesses, the law and the prophets. And I guess the point I'm trying to make is that the law did not bring about the righteousness of God. It only pointed to it. It only pointed it out. And when you think about law and prophets, you could also take that to look at it from this standpoint: the revelation and the ministers. It's another way of putting that, right? The revelation and the ministers. The revelation and the ministers didn't bring about the righteousness of God either. They just pointed to it, just like the law did. They just point, there it is, over there. That's how it works. They didn't bring it about. The law was not a set of conditions that you had to meet to get the righteousness of God. Never was. The law was the roadmap to lead you to it. It was the thing that would point to it so you could see it. And once the New Testament came, it became more visible. It's kind of hidden in the Old Testament. In the New Testament, it's lightened up. Okay. Verse 22. Even the righteousness of God, which is by faith of Jesus Christ, unto all and upon all them that believe, for there is no difference. All right. Righteousness of God comes by the faith of Jesus Christ. That's what I'm going to leave you with. We're going to pick up and massage this one really well next week. But I want to leave you with that the righteousness of God, God's righteousness, comes by Jesus Christ's faith. It's His faith that brings about the righteousness of God, not ours. And that's important to hang on to. So think about that over the course of the next week, and when we come back, then we'll work through it and try to explain it better. With that, I thank you for your kind and patient attention this morning. Let's stand and be dismissed in prayer.